Friedrich Heinrich Karl Fritz Haarmann was a German serial killer, known as the Butcher of Hanover, the Vampire of Hanover and the Wolf Man, who committed the sexual assault, murder, mutilation, and dismemberment of at least 24 young men and boys between 1918 and 1924 in the city of Hanover. Haarmann was found guilty of 24 of the 27 murders for which he was tried and sentenced to death by beheading in December 1924. In addition, in accordance with German practice, his honorary rights of citizenship were revoked. He was subsequently executed by guillotine in April 1925. Haarmann became known as the Butcher of Hanover, German, Der Schlachter von Hanover, due to the extensive mutilation and dismemberment committed upon his victims' bodies and by such titles as the Vampire of Hanover, Der Vampir von Hanover, and the Wolf Man, Wolfsmensch, because of his preferred murder method of biting into or through his victims' throats. Fritz Haarmann was born in Hanover on October 25, 1879, the sixth and youngest child born to Johanna, née Claudius, and Ollie Haarmann. Haarmann was a quiet child, with few friends his own age or gender and who seldom socialized with any children outside of school with the exception of his siblings. From an early age, Haarmann's behavior was noticeably effeminate, and he was known to shun boys' activities, instead playing with his sister's dolls and dressing in their clothes. He also developed a passion for both needlework and cookery, and would develop a close relationship with his mother, who spoiled her youngest child. Reportedly, Haarmann's father married his mother when she was 41 years old and 7 years his senior, largely due to her wealth and the substantial dowry their marriage would eventually bring him. Haarmann Sr. was known to be argumentative and short-tempered who, through several affairs he conducted throughout his marriage, would contract syphilis in his later years. Despite his being an authoritarian who had little time for his children and a notorious womanizer, Haarmann's parents remained together until his mother's death in April 1901. In 1886, Haarmann began his schooling, where he was noted by teachers to be a spoiled and mollycoddled child who was prone to daydreaming. Although his behavior at school was noted to be exemplary, his academic performance was below average and Haarmann had to repeat a school year twice. On one occasion, when he was about 8 years old, Haarmann was molested by one of his teachers, although he never discussed this incident in detail. Haarmann grew into a trim, physically strong youth. With his parents' consent, he finished his schooling in 1894. Upon leaving school, he briefly obtained employment as an apprentice locksmith in Neuf-Brissac, now part of France, before opting, at age 15, to enroll in a military academy in the town of Breisach. His military training began on April 4, 1895. Haarmann initially adapted to military life and performed well as a trainee soldier. However, after 5 months of military service, he began to suffer periodic lapses of consciousness which, although initially described by a medical professional as being sudden signs of anxiety neurosis, would subsequently be diagnosed as being equivalent to epilepsy in October 1895. The following month, Haarmann discharged himself from the military and returned to Hanover, where he briefly worked in a cigar factory his father had established in 1888. At age 16, Haarmann committed his first known sexual offenses, all of which involved young boys whom he would lure to secluded areas, typically cellars, before proceeding to sexually abuse them. He was first arrested for committing offenses of this nature in July 1896. Following further offenses, the Division for Criminal Matters opted to place Haarmann in a mental institution in the city of Hildesheim in February 1897. Although briefly transferred to a Hanover hospital for psychiatric evaluation, he would be certified as being incurably deranged and unfit to stand trial by a psychologist named Gurt Schmalfuss. Schmalfuss ordered Haarmann to be confined at the mental institution indefinitely. He was returned to the institution on May 28, 1897. 7 months later, in January 1898, Haarmann escaped the mental institution and, with apparent assistance from his mother, he fled to Zurich in Switzerland. Here, he lived with a relative of his mother and obtained employment as a handyman in a shipyard. Haarmann remained in Zurich for 16 months before he returned to Hanover in April 1899. Early the following year, he seduced and subsequently became engaged to a woman named Erna Lohuert, who soon became pregnant with his child. In October 1900, Haarmann received notification to perform his compulsory military service. On October 12, 1900, Haarmann was deployed to the Alsatian city of Colmar to serve in the No. 10 Rifle Battalion. Throughout his service, He earned a reputation among his superiors as an exemplary soldier and excellent marksman, and he would later describe this period of service as being the happiest of his entire life. After collapsing while on exercise with his battalion in October 1901, Harman began to suffer dizzy spells and was subsequently hospitalized for over 4 months. He was later deemed unsuitable for service and work and was discharged on July 28, 1902. Discharged from the military under medical terms described as being probable dementia praecox, Harman was awarded a monthly pension of 21 gold marks. Upon his discharge, Harman returned to live with Erna in Hanover, briefly working again in his father's cigar factory. However, he soon filed a maintenance lawsuit against his father, citing that he was unable to work due to the ailments noted by the military. Harman's father successfully contested the suit and the charges were dropped. The following year, a violent fight between father and son resulted in Harman's father himself unsuccessfully initiating legal proceedings against his son, citing verbal death threats and blackmail as justification to have his son returned to a mental institution. These charges were dropped due to a lack of corroborating evidence. Nonetheless, Harman was ordered to undertake a psychiatric examination in May 1903. This examination was conducted by a Dr. Andrei, who concluded that, although morally inferior, Harman was not mentally unstable. With financial assistance from his father, Harman and his fiancée opened a fishmongery. Harman himself briefly attempted to work as an insurance salesman before being officially classified as disabled and unable to work by the 10th Army in 1904. As a result, his monthly pension was slightly increased. The same year, his fiancée, while pregnant with his child, terminated their engagement after he accused her of having an affair with a student. As the fishmongery was registered in her name, Erna simply ordered her husband to leave the premises. For the next decade, Harman primarily lived as a petty thief, burglar, and con artist. Although he did occasionally obtain legitimate employment, he invariably stole from his employers or their customers. Beginning in 1905, he served several short prison sentences for offenses such as larceny, embezzlement, and assault. On one occasion when working legitimately as an invoice clerk, Harman became acquainted with a female employee with whom, he later claimed, to have robbed several tombstones and graves between 1905 and 1913. He was never charged with these offenses. Consequently, Harman spent the majority of the years between 1905 and 1912 in jail. In late 1913, Harman was arrested for burglary. A search of his home revealed a hoard of stolen property linking him to several other burglaries. Despite protesting his innocence, Harman was charged with and convicted of a series of burglaries and frauds. He was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for these offenses. Due to compulsory conscription resulting from the outbreak of World War I, Germany saw a shortage of available domestic manpower. In the final years of his prison sentence, Harman was permitted to work throughout the day in the grounds of various manor houses near the town of Rendsburg, with instructions to return to prison each evening. Upon his release from prison in April 1918, he initially moved to Berlin, before opting to return to Hanover, where he briefly lived with one of his sisters before renting a single-room apartment in late August 1918. According to Harman, he was struck by the poverty of the German nation as a result of the loss the nation had suffered in World War I. Through his initial efforts to both trade and purchase stolen property at Hanover Central Station, Harman established several criminal contacts with whom he could trade in contraband property, and he immediately reverted to the criminal life he had lived before his 1913 arrest. Despite police knowledge that Harman was both a known criminal and a known homosexual, he gradually began to establish a relationship with law enforcement as an informer, largely as a means of redirecting the attention of the police from himself in his own criminal activities, and to facilitate his access to young males. By 1919, Harman is known to have regularly patrolled Hanover Station, and to have provided police with information relating to the city's extensive criminal network. With the cooperation of several police officials, Harman devised a ruse whereby he would offer to fence or store stolen property at his premises, then pass this information to police, who would then raid his property at agreed times and arrest these contacts. To remove any suspicion as to his treachery reaching the criminal fraternity, Harman himself would be arrested in these raids. Moreover, on numerous occasions, he is known to have performed citizens' arrests upon commuters for offenses such as traveling on forged documents. As a result of these activities, police began to rely on Harman as a reliable source of information regarding various criminal activities in Hanover, and he was allowed to patrol the station largely at will. Between 1918 and 1924, Harman committed at least 24 murders, although he is suspected of murdering a minimum of 27. All of his victims were males between the ages of 10 and 22, the majority of whom were in their mid to late teens. The victims were lured back to one of 3 addresses in which Harman is known to have resided throughout those years. He is known to have killed upon the promise of assistance, accommodation, work, or under the pretense of arrest. At Harman's apartment, the victim was typically given food and drink before Harman bit into his Adam's apple, often as he was strangled. Often this caused the victim to die of asphyxiation, but on several occasions Harman bit completely through his victim's Adam's apple and trachea. Harman referred to the act of biting through his victim's neck as his love bite. All of Harman's known victims were dismembered before their bodies were discarded, usually in the Lane River, although the dismembered body of his first known victim had simply been buried, and the body of his last victim had been thrown into a lake located at the entrance to the Herrenhausen Gardens. Harman typically kept his victims' personal possessions, for himself or for his lover, Hans Granz, or they were sold on the black market through criminal contacts both men had established at Hanover Central Station. However, the personal possessions of some victims were sold to legitimate retailers. In several instances, both Harman and Granz gave possessions belonging to various victims to acquaintances as gifts. Following Harman's arrest, rumors circulated that Harman ate the flesh of his victims, or sold it on the black market as pork or horse meat. Although no evidence was ever produced to confirm these theories, Harman was known to be an active trader in contraband meat, which was invariably boneless, diced and often sold as ground meat. When asked where he obtained the meat, Harman sometimes said he had gotten it from a butcher named Karl. Harman initially resided in a hotel, before he and Granz lodged with a middle-class family. Harman's first known victim was a 17-year-old runaway named Friedel Roth. When Roth disappeared on September 25, 1918, his friends told police he was last seen with Harman, who at the time of this first known murder resided in a single-room apartment at 27 Sellerstrasse. Under pressure from Roth's family, police raided Harman's apartment in October 1918, where they found their informer in the company of a semi-naked 13-year-old boy. He was charged with both the sexual assault and battery of a minor, and sentenced to 9 months imprisonment. Harman later said to detectives that when they searched his apartment, the head of Friedel Roth was stowed behind his stove wrapped in newspaper. Harman avoided serving his sentence throughout 1919. That October, he met an 18-year-old youth named Hans Granz, who had run away from his home in Berlin following an argument with his father on October 1. Granz had slept rough in and around Hanover Station for approximately 2 weeks selling old clothes in and around the station to earn enough money to simply eat before he encountered Harman. In his subsequent confessions to police, Granz stated that, although his sexual orientation was heterosexual, he himself initiated contact with Harman, with the intention of prostituting himself, having heard of Harman's homosexuality through acquaintances he had established in Hanover. Harman himself stated following his arrest that he viewed Granz as being like a son to him, adding that he pulled him out of the ditch and tried to make sure he didn't go to the dogs. Shortly after their initial acquaintance, Harman invited the youth to move into his apartment, and Granz became Harman's lover and criminal accomplice. According to Harman, although he was smitten with Granz, he gradually became aware the youth manipulated and, occasionally, mocked him. A few times Granz was evicted after heated arguments only for Harman to plead with him to come back. Despite the manipulation Harman endured at the hands of his accomplice, he later claimed to tolerate the capitulation as he craved Granz's companionship and affection, adding, "I had to have someone I meant everything to." Harman served the 9-month prison sentence imposed in 1918 for sexual assault and battery between March and December 1920. Upon his release, he again regained the trust of the police and again became an informer. Harman initially resided in a hotel, before he and Granz lodged with a middle-class family. Through criminal contacts, Harman became aware of a vacant ground-floor apartment located at 8 Neue Strasse. The apartment was located in a densely populated, old house located alongside the Lane River. Harman secured a letting agreement with the landlady, ostensibly to use the property for storage purposes. He and Granz moved into 8 Neue Strasse on July 1, 1921. Harman's subsequent victims largely consisted of young male commuters, runaways and, occasionally, male prostitutes, whom he would typically encounter in or around Hanover's Central Railway Station. The second murder Harman is known to have committed occurred on February 12, 1923. The victim was a 17-year-old pianist named Fritz Franke, whom Harman encountered at Hanover Central Station and invited to his Neue Strasse residence, where he introduced the youth to Hans Granz and two female acquaintances, one of whom was Granz's female lover. According to Granz's lover, that evening, Granz whispered in her ear, "Hey, he's going to be trampled on today." The following day, both these acquaintances returned to Harman's apartment, where they were informed by Harman that Franke had traveled to Hamburg. Speculation remains as to Granz's knowledge of Harman's intentions towards Franke when he made this comment to the two female acquaintances. According to Harman, following this murder, Granz arrived unannounced at his apartment, where he observed Franke's nude body lying upon Harman's bed. Granz had then simply looked at him and asked, "When shall I come back again?" 5 weeks after the murder of Franke, on March 20, Harman encountered a 17-year-old commuter named Wilhelm Schultz at Hanover Station. Schultz had been traveling to work when he encountered Harman. No human remains identified as belonging to Schultz were ever found, although most of his clothing was in the possession of Harman's landlady, Elisabeth Engel, at the time of his arrest. 2 more victims are known to have been murdered at 8 Neue Strasse before Harman vacated the apartment in June. 16-year-old Roland Hutch, who disappeared on May 23 after informing a close friend he intended to run away from home and join the Marines, and 19-year-old Hans Sonnenfeld, who disappeared on or about May 31 and whose distinctive yellow overcoat Harman is known to have worn after the youth's murder. On June 9, 1923, Harman moved into a single-room attic apartment at 2 Rote Riehe. 2 weeks after moving into this address, on June 25, Ernst Ehrenberg, the 13-year-old son of Harman's neighbor, disappeared running an errand for his father. His school cap and braces would be found in Harman's apartment following his arrest. 2 months later, on August 24, an 18-year-old office clerk named Heinrich Struss was reported missing by his aunt, with whom he lived. Many of Struss's belongings would also be found in Harman's apartment. Struss's murder would be followed 1 month later by the murder of a 17-year-old named Paul Broniszewski, who disappeared en route to the city of Bochum, having worked with his uncle in Saxony-Anhalt throughout the summer. Subsequent police inquiries suggested Broniszewski had likely alighted the train at Hanover, where he evidently encountered Harman. Broniszewski's jacket, knapsack, trousers, and towel would all be found in the possession of Harman following his arrest. Harman is next known to have killed on or about September 30, 1923. The victim was 17-year-old Richard Graf, who last informed his family he had met an individual at Hanover Station who knows of a good job for me. 2 weeks later, on October 12, a 16-year-old Gerdon youth named Wilhelm Erdner failed to return home from work. Subsequent inquiries by Erdner's parents revealed the youth became acquainted with a detective Fritz Honnerbrock, a pseudonym used by Harman, shortly before his disappearance. Both Harman and Granz subsequently sold Erdner's bicycle on October 20. Within a week of having sold this bicycle, Harman killed 2 further victims, 15-year-old Hermann Wolf, who disappeared from Hanover Station on October 24, and 13-year-old Heinz Brinkmann, who was seen by a witness standing in the entrance to Hanover Station at 11 p.m. on October 27, having missed his train home to the town of Clausthal. On November 10, 1923, a 17-year-old apprentice carpenter from the city of Dusseldorf named Adolf Hannepel disappeared from Hanover Station. He was seen by several witnesses sitting upon a trunk in the waiting room. These witnesses also positively identified Hans Granz in the company of Harman pointing towards the youth, who shortly thereafter was observed walking towards a cafe in the company of these 2 men. 1 month later, on December 6, 19-year-old Adolf Hennies disappeared. He had been seeking employment at the time of his disappearance. None of the human remains recovered were identified as belonging to Hennies, whom Harman specifically admitted to dismembering, but denied killing. In subsequent court testimony vehemently disputed by Granz, Harman claimed he returned home to find Hennies's body missing his signature love bite lying naked on his bed, with Granz and another criminal acquaintance named Hugo Witkowski stating the youth was one of yours. Neither Harman nor Granz were convicted of Hennies's murder due to conflicting testimony. The first victim killed by Harman in 1924 was 17-year-old Ernst Speaker, who disappeared on January 5. Although subsequent trial testimony from a friend of Speaker indicated Harman had become acquainted with this youth before his murder, Harman stated he would simply have to assume this youth was one of his victims due to all his personal possessions being found in his or Grand's possession following his arrest. 10 days later, Harman killed a 20-year-old named Heinrich Cook, whom he is also believed to have been acquainted with prior to the youth's murder. The following month, Harman is known to have killed 2 further victims, 19-year-old Willie Singer, who disappeared from the suburb of Linden-Limmer on February 2, having informed his sister he was to travel with a friend, and 16-year-old Herman Speechert, who was last seen by his sister on February 8. Harman is not known to have killed again until on or about April 1, when he is believed to have killed an acquaintance named Herman Bach. Although cleared of this murder at his trial, Harman was in possession of Bach's clothing when arrested, and he is known to have given the youth's suitcase to his landlady. Moreover, Harman is known to have actively dissuaded several of Bach's acquaintances from reporting the youth missing. 1 week later, on April 8, 16-year-old Alfred Hogarth disappeared from Hanover Station, having run away from home in the town of Leert on April 2. Hogarth's murder would be followed 9 days later by that of a 16-year-old apprentice named Wilhelm Apel, whom Harman encountered on his patrols of the Hanover-Leinhausen station. On April 26, 18-year-old Robert Witzel disappeared after borrowing 50 pfennigs from his mother, explaining he intended to visit a traveling circus. Inquiries by the youth's parents revealed their son had accompanied an official from the railway station to the circus. Harman himself would later state he killed Witzel the same evening and, having dismembered the youth's body, had thrown the remains into the Leine River. 2 weeks after the murder of Witzel, Harman killed a 14-year-old named Heinz Martin, who was last seen by his mother on May 9 and who is believed to have been abducted from Hanover Station. All his clothing was later found in Harman's apartment. Less than 3 weeks later, on May 26, a 17-year-old traveling salesman from the town of Kassel named Fritz Wittig, whom Harman would later state he killed upon the insistence of Granz as he had worn a good new suit Granz coveted, was dismembered and discarded in the Leine River. The same day Wittig is believed to have been killed, Harman killed his youngest known victim, 10-year-old Friedrich Abeling, who disappeared while truant from school. His murder would be followed less than 2 weeks later by that of 16-year-old Friedrich Cook, who was approached by Harman on June 5 as he walked to college. 2 acquaintances of Cook would later testify at Harman's trial that, as they walked with Cook to college, Harman approached Cook and tapped the youth on the boot with his walking stick and stated, "Well, boy, don't you recognize me?" Harman killed his final victim, 17-year-old Eric de Vries, on June 14, 1924. De Vries encountered Harman at Hanover Station. His dismembered body would later be found in a lake located near the entrance to the Herrenhausen Gardens. Harman would confess it had taken him 4 separate trips to carry de Vries's dismembered remains carried in the leather bag which had belonged to Friedrich Koch to the location he had disposed of them. On May 17, 1924, 2 children playing near the Leine River discovered a human skull. Determined to be that of a young male aged between 18 and 20 and bearing evidence of knife wounds, police were skeptical as to whether a murder had been committed or whether the skull had either been discarded in this location by grave robbers, or placed there in a tasteless prank by medical students. Furthermore, police theorized the skull may have been discarded in the river at Alfeld, which had recently experienced an outbreak of typhoid. 2 weeks later, on May 29, a second skull was found behind a mill race located close to the scene of the earlier discovery. This skull was also identified as having been that of a young male aged between 18 and 20. Shortly thereafter, 2 boys playing in a field close to the village of Dorin discovered a sack containing numerous human bones. 2 more skulls would be found on June 13, one upon the banks of the Leine River, another located close to a mill in West Hanover. Each of the skulls had been removed from the vertebrae with a sharp instrument. 1 skull belonged to a male in his late teens, whereas the other belonged to a boy estimated to have been aged between 11 and 13 years old. In addition, one of these skulls also bore evidence of having been scalped. For more than a year prior to these discoveries, rumors had circulated in Hanover about the fate of the sheer number of children and teenagers who had been reported missing in the city. The discoveries sparked fresh rumors regarding missing and murdered children. In addition, various newspapers responded to these discoveries and the resulting rumors by harking to the disproportionate number of young people who had been reported missing in Hanover between 1918 and 1924. On June 8, several hundred Hanover residents converged close to the Lane River and searched both the banks of the river and the surrounding areas, discovering a number of human bones, which were handed to the police. In response to these latest discoveries, police decided to drag the entire section of the river which ran through the center of the city. In doing so, they discovered more than 500 further human bones and sections of bodies, many bearing knife striations, which were later confirmed by a court doctor as having belonged to at least 22 separate human individuals. Approximately half of the remains had been in the river for some time, whereas other bones and body parts had been discarded in the river more recently. Many of the recent and aged discoveries bore evidence of having been dissected, particularly at the joints. Over 30% of the remains were judged to have belonged to young males aged between 15 and 20. Suspicion for the discoveries quickly fell upon Harman, who was known to both the police and the Criminal Investigation Department as a homosexual who had amassed 15 previous convictions dating from 1896 for various offenses including child molestation and the sexual assault and battery of a minor. Moreover, he had been connected to the 1918 disappearances of Friedel Roth and a 14-year-old named Herman Cook, who had disappeared weeks prior to Roth. Harman was placed under surveillance. Being a trusted police informant, Harman was known to frequent Hanover Central Station. As he was well known to many officers from Hanover, 2 young policemen were drafted from Berlin to pose as undercover officers and discreetly observe his movements. The surveillance of Harman began on June 18, 1924. On the night of June 22, Harman was observed by the 2 undercover officers prowling Hanover's Central Station. He was soon observed arguing with a 15-year-old boy named Karl Fromm, then to approach police and insist they arrest the youth on the charge of traveling upon forged documents. Upon his arrest, Fromm informed police he had been living with Harman for 4 days, and that he had been repeatedly raped by his accuser, sometimes as a knife was held to his throat. Harman was arrested the following morning and charged with sexual assault. Following his arrest, Harman's attic apartment at number 2 Rotriehe was searched. Harman had lived in this single-room apartment since June 1923. The flooring, walls, and bedding within the apartment were found to be extensively bloodstained. Harman initially attempted to explain this fact as a byproduct of his illegal trading in contraband meat. Various acquaintances and former neighbors of Harman were also extensively questioned as to his activities. Many fellow tenants and neighbors of the various addresses in which Harman lived since 1920 commented to detectives about the number of teenage boys they observed visiting his various addresses. Moreover, some had seen him leaving his property with concealed sacks, bags or baskets invariably in the late evening or early morning hours. 2 former tenants informed police that, in the spring of 1924, they had discreetly followed Harman from his apartment and observed him discarding a heavy sack into the Lane River. The clothes and personal possessions found at Harman's apartment and in the possession of his acquaintances were suspected as being the property of missing youths. All were confiscated and put on display at Hanover Police Station, with the parents of missing teenage boys from across Germany invited to look at the items. As successive days passed, an increasing number of items were identified by family members as having belonged to their sons and brothers. Harman did initially attempt to dismiss these successive revelations as being circumstantial in nature by explaining he acquired many of these items through his business of trading in used clothing, with other items being left at his apartment by youths with whom he engaged in sexual activity. The turning point came when, on June 29, clothes, boots and keys found stowed at Harman's apartment were identified as belonging to a missing 18-year-old named Robert Witzel. A skull which had been found in a garden on May 20, which was not initially connected with later skeletal discoveries, was identified as that of the missing youth. A friend of Witzel identified a police officer seen in the company of the youth the day prior to his disappearance as Harman. Confronted with this evidence, Harman briefly attempted to bluster his way out of these latest and most damning pieces of evidence. When Witzel's jacket was found in the possession of his landlady and he was confronted with various witnesses' testimony as to his destroying identification marks upon the clothing, he broke down and had to be supported by his sister. Faced with this latest evidence, and upon the urging of his sister, Harman confessed to raping, killing, and dismembering many young men in what he initially described as a rabid sexual passion between 1918 and 1924. According to Harman, he never actually intended to murder any of his victims, but would be seized by an irresistible urge to bite into or through their Adam's apple often as he manually strangled them in the throes of ecstasy, before typically collapsing atop the victim's body. Only one intended victim had escaped from Harman's apartment after he attempted to bite into his Adam's apple, although this individual is not known to have reported the attack to police. All of Harman's victims' bodies were disposed of via dismemberment shortly after their murder, and Harman was insistent that he found the act of dismemberment extremely unpleasant. He stated, been ill for 8 days after his first murder. Nonetheless, Harman was insistent that his passion at the moment of murder was invariably stronger than the horror of the cutting and the chopping which would inevitably follow, and would typically take up to 2 days to complete. To fortify himself to dismember his victims' bodies, Harman would pour himself a cup of strong black coffee, then place the body of his victim upon the floor of this apartment and cover the face with cloth, before first removing the intestines, which he would place inside a bucket. A towel would then be repeatedly placed inside the abdominal cavity to soak the collecting blood. He would then make 3 cuts between the victim's ribs and shoulders, then take hold of the ribs and push until the bones around the shoulders broke. The victim's heart, lungs, and kidneys would then be removed, diced, and placed in the same bucket which held the intestines before the legs and arms would be severed from the body. Harman would then begin paring the flesh from the limbs and torso. This surplus flesh would be disposed of in the toilet or, usually, in the nearby river. The final section of the victim's bodies to be dismembered was invariably the head. After severing the head from the torso, Harman would use a small kitchen knife to strip all flesh from the skull, which he would then wrap in rags and place face downwards upon a pile of straw and bludgeon with an axe until the skull splintered, enabling him to access the brain. This he would also place in a bucket, which he would pour, alongside the chopped up bones in the lane. Harman was insistent that none of the skulls found in the lane belonged to his victims, and that the forensic identification of the skull of Robert Witzel was mistaken, as he had almost invariably smashed his victims' skulls to pieces. The exceptions being those of his earliest victims killed several years prior to his arrest and that of his last victim, Eric de Vries. Although insistent that none of his murders were premeditated, investigators discovered much circumstantial evidence suggesting that several murders had been planned hours or days in advance, and that Harman had both concocted explanations for his victims' disappearances and dissuaded acquaintances of his victims from filing missing persons reports with Hanover police. Investigators also noted that Harman would only confess to murders for which there existed evidence against him. On one occasion, Harman stated, "There are some you don't know about, but it's not those you think." When asked how many victims he killed, Harman claimed, somewhere between 50 and 70. The police, however, could only connect Harman with the disappearance of 27 youths, and he was charged with 27 murders, some of which he claimed were committed upon the insistence of Hans Granz, who was arrested on July 8, and formally charged with being an accessory to murder 1 week later. On August 16, 1924, Harman underwent a psychological examination at a Göttingen medical school. On September 25, he was judged competent to stand trial and returned to Hanover to await trial. The trial of Fritz Harman and Hans Granz began on December 4, 1924. Harman was charged with the murder of 27 boys and young men who had disappeared between September 1918 and June 1924. In 14 of these cases, Harman, who insisted upon conducting his own defense, acknowledged his guilt, although he claimed to be uncertain of the identification of the remaining 13 victims upon the list of charges. Granz pleaded not guilty to charges of being an accessory to murder in several of the murders. Initially, following a thorough security search, all members of the public were permitted access to the courtroom, although by the third day the judge excluded all spectators from the courtroom in the opening days of the trial as each murder was discussed in detail, due to the ongoing carnal and gruesome nature of the revelations. The trial was one of the first major modern media events in Germany, and received extensive international press coverage, being described as the most revolting in German criminal history. Varying sensational headlines in which Harman was variously referred to by such titles as the Butcher of Hanover, the Vampire of Hanover, and the Wolf Man continuously appeared in the press. Although Harman denied any premeditation in the crimes, and remained adamant the ultimate reason he killed was a mystery to him. He readily confessed to having killed 14 of the victims for whose murder he was tried and to retaining and selling many of their possessions, although he denied having sold the body parts of any of his victims as contraband meat. Harmon's denial that he had either consumed or sold human flesh would be supported by a medical expert, who testified on December 6 that none of the meat found in Harmon's apartment following his arrest was human. When asked to identify photographs of his victims, Harman became taciturn and dismissive as he typically claimed to be unable to recognize any of his victims' photographs. However, in instances where he claimed to be unable to recognize his victims' faces but the victims' clothing or other personal belongings had been found in his possession, he would simply shrug and make comments to the effect of, "I probably killed him," or, "Charge it to me, it's all right with me." For example, when asked to identify a photograph of victim Alfred Hogarth, Harman stated, "I certainly assume I killed Hogarth, but I don't remember his face." Numerous exhibits were introduced into evidence in the opening days of the trial, including 285 sections of the skeletal structure, particularly skulls and thigh bones recovered from the Lane River and forensically determined as belonging to young men under 20 years of age, which had been retrieved from the Lane River, the bucket into which he stored and transported human remains, and the extensively blood-stained camp bed upon which he had killed many of the victims at his Rote Riahi address. As had been the case when earlier asked whether he could recognize the photographs of any of his victims, Harmon's demeanor became dismissive upon the introduction of these exhibits. He denied any of the skulls introduced into evidence belonged to his victims, stating he had almost invariably mashed the victims' skulls, and had thrown only one undamaged skull into the river. Several acquaintances and criminal associates of Harman testified for the prosecution, including former neighbors who testified to having purchased brawn or mince from Harman, whom they noted regularly left his apartment with packages of meat, but rarely arrived with them. Harman's landlady, Elizabeth Engel, testified that Harman would regularly pour chopped pieces of meat into boiling water and would strain fat from meat Harman claimed was pork. This fat would invariably be poured into bottles. On one occasion in April 1924, Harman's landlady and her family became ill after eating sausages in skins Harman claimed were sheep's intestines. Another neighbor testified to the alarming number of youths whom he had seen entering Harman's Neue Strasse apartment, but whom he seldom observed leaving the address. This neighbor assumed Harman was selling youths to the Foreign Legion. Another neighbor testified to having observed Harman throw a sack of bones into the Lane River. Two female acquaintances of Hans Granz also testified how, on one occasion in 1923, they discovered what they believed to be a human mouth boiling in a soup kettle in Harman's apartment. These witnesses testified they had taken the item to Hanover police, who simply replied the piece of flesh may be a pig's snout. By the second week of the trial, testimony was introduced about how much the police knew about Harman's criminal activities after his 1918 release from prison. The police apparently never suspected him for any of the cases of missing boys and young men in Hanover in 1923 and 1924, even though some of the victims were last seen in his company, and he had a long criminal record that included charges of sexual assault and battery. The trial lasted barely 2 weeks, and a total of 190 witnesses testified. On December 19, 1924, court reconvened to impose sentence upon both defendants. Judged sane and accountable for his actions, Harman was found guilty of 24 of the 27 murders and sentenced to death by beheading. He was acquitted of 3 murders which he denied committing. Upon hearing the sentence, Harman stood before the court and proclaimed, "I accept the verdict fully and freely," before adding, "I go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily." Granz became hysterical upon hearing he had been found guilty of incitement to murder and sentenced to death by beheading in relation to the murder of victim Adolf Hanapel, with an additional sentence of 12 years imprisonment imposed for being an accessory to murder in the case of victim Fritz Wittig. Upon returning to his cell after hearing the verdict, Granz collapsed. In the case of Hanapel, several witnesses testified to having seen Granz, in the company of Harman, pointing towards the youth. Harman claimed this was one of 2 murders committed upon the insistence of Granz, and for this reason, Granz was sentenced to death. In the case of Wittig, police found a handwritten note from Harman, dated the day of Wittig's disappearance and signed by both him and Granz, in which Granz agreed to pay Harman 20 gold marks for the youth's suit. As the note indicated Granz's possible knowledge in the disappearance of Wittig, He was convicted of being an accomplice to Harman in this murder and sentenced to 12 years imprisonment. Harman made no appeal against the verdict, claiming his death would atone for his crimes and stating that, were he at liberty, he would likely kill again. Granz did lodge an appeal against his sentence, although his appeal was rejected on February 6, 1925. At 6 o'clock on the morning of April 15, 1925, Fritz Harman was beheaded by guillotine in the grounds of Hanover prison. His executioner was Karl Groppler. In accordance with German tradition, Harman was not informed of his execution date until the prior evening. Upon receipt of the news, he observed prayer with his pastor, before being granted his final wishes of an expensive cigar to smoke and Brazilian coffee to drink in his cell. No members of the press were permitted to witness the execution, and the event was seen by only a handful of witnesses. According to published reports, although Harman was pale and nervous, he maintained a sense of bravado as he walked to the guillotine. The last words Harman spoke were, "I am guilty, gentlemen, but, hard though it may be, I want to die as a man." Immediately prior to placing his head upon the execution apparatus, Harman added, "I repent, but I do not fear death." You have come to the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. This has been a Barrington Academy True Crime production, home of intellectual discussions and true crime. We are kindly asking for your feedbacks on our videos, whether positive or negative. Peace out for now.